Good afternoon, Chairperson. I'm honored to be speaking to you on the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. I'm Violetta Nikolskaya, Senior Analyst for YWCA Hamilton, which is the city's oldest and largest multi-service women's organization, having served this community for over 130 years. YWCA Hamilton is part of the Hamilton is Home Alliance of community housing providers. This alliance consists of independent nonprofits, which are nonpartisan organizations who work with all elected officials to help advance housing solutions. We're sharing our knowledge and experience so that our community can achieve maximum and permanent public benefits. YWCA Hamilton has continued to offer services across the housing continuum, including supporting persons in their housing needs amidst the global health crisis in our country. YWCA Hamilton is eagerly awaiting the completion of our Ottawa Street build, which will include 50 affordable units for persons with developmental disabilities, women, and women-led households. We know firsthand the many reasons as to why building affordable housing must be one of the city's top priorities, especially during this national housing crisis. Along with building affordable housing, we must ensure that tenants are able to maintain their housing stability, are knowledgeable of their rights, and have the rental housing they occupy maintained in good repair by the property owners. I'm speaking before you today to highlight YWCA Hamilton's support for recommendations advocated for by ACORN Hamilton and to speak to those made by the Housing Services Department outlined in their submission to this committee. We support ACORN's request that the city should expand and permanently implement the Tenant Defense Fund and add tenant outreach and education to its mandate, as well as expanding the criteria for eligibility to include tenants at risk of displacement. As a provider of drop-in and transitional living services for our city's most vulnerable women and non-binary residents, and a provider of services to newcomers, seniors, and Two-Spirit LGBTQ youth, we see ourselves as part of the effort to educate and provide information for those who need the Tenant Defense Fund. Nonprofit service providers are and will be part of the effort to engage our community in this conversation, but we need the city's efforts as well to achieve the most comprehensive tenant outreach and education. Tactics that have worked in other communities with similar programs include having a hotline for those without computer or internet access. It includes doing a study on and reducing the barriers to the application process. A lack of uptake in a program is often correlated, if not caused, by a lack of awareness of its existence. Although the report from the Housing Services Department recommends the outreach and education of the Defense Fund, there's an absence in the report of how this will be mechanized. It's imperative that this effort be clearly outlined and fleshed out. The issue of renovictions has been an issue for many residents of Hamilton. The metrics of whom this has impacted cannot be captured by the rates of N13 applications that have appeared before the board alone. The city must consider the number of residents who have been pressured into accepting buyouts without knowledge of their rights and alternative options. The city could collect the number of residents who were issued N13s that do not appear before the board. We must talk to our seniors, newcomers, students, single persons, and long-standing residents of affordable housing to see the recent pressures placed on them to submit and accommodate to the desires of investors aiming to capitalize on a pernicious private housing market. We support the recommendations for the Tenant Defense Fund grant amount eligible to tenants for legal fees to be increased. The cost of paralegal and legal representation has increased, especially given volume and the added barriers caused by the pandemic. It is an equitable step for the amount to be increased beyond the recommended $2,500, as this rate may not cover more complex cases. It is encouraged that more consultation occur to ensure that the maximum grant amount is linked to studies of how costly these proceedings can become. We join our fellow housing advocates in imploring the Housing Services Department and other adjacent departments to do a thorough study on feasibility of a citywide landlord licensing program and a study on the mechanization of how the city will keep landlords accountable in maintaining their buildings in good repair and standing. Such programs exist in other municipalities who acted creatively and exhausted all of the city's resources to find a way to be proactive. Consider tasking the Housing Services Department to complete the aforementioned feasibility studies and ask for the mechanization before considering this file completed. One day it will be too late for us to get ahead of this crisis, but it is not too late for us to act now. Thank you for your time, Council. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have and that I can speak to.
Hello, Chair, councilors, and city staff. I'm sure by now you know I'm Carl Andrus, Community Benefits Manager at the HCBN and member of the Just Recovery Coalition. I'm here to talk about item 10.1, Tenant Defense Fund. As I'm sure many of you recall, a policy paper was submitted to the City of Hamilton to ask this council to consider ways to help mitigate the effects of COVID-19 pandemic and usher in a better Hamilton in the post-COVID world. As this third wave impacts all of our lives, I think it's important to remind you of some of the relevant items from that document on today's topic. The idea, and one of our core principles in the paper, housing is a human right. The idea that we all need a place to call home. I'll remind you of the words of the Ontario Human Rights Commission report. Adequate housing is essential to one's sense of dignity, safety, inclusion, and ability to contribute to the fabric of our neighborhoods and societies. I would remind you of the paper's recommendation number 56. Use all of the city's regulatory powers to protect tenants from predatory renoviction practices and save Hamilton's affordable housing stock. It's a pandemic and everyone is exhausted, stretched to the limit. But the topic before you will have a direct impact on the lives of thousands of families. I want you to ask, is the solution before you bold, imaginative? Is it really all you can do with the resources of paid staff, legal experts? That's for you to decide. The N13 is a powerful tool, sometimes used legally, often used illegally. In the middle of a massive housing crisis, soaring unaffordable rents, and booming property market, its use can literally be life or death for a family. Putting aside the massive human cost of its use, I want to talk to you about another cost, the cost to the city itself. Take a large building like this, 120 units and 320 people. The building is older and has many private sector affordable units. Everyone is renovated. 320 people are now displaced. Many will not be able to afford to find other accommodations as buildings across the city undergo the same. What happens to those people? What about the many other older buildings that might cause displacement? They will turn to the city and city services for support. That makes them a new extra expense on your already overstretched budget. Extra policing costs, more mental health supports, more homeless shelters, EMS services, longer wait times for social housing, new capital costs to build, more tents on our streets. If you cannot consider the incredible human toll of renovations on Hamilton residents, perhaps consider the budgetary ones. Keeping people in their homes will provide a magnitude of savings as well as being the right thing to do. I hope you keep that in mind as you debate the item before you. Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon, councillors and city staff. I think Carl from the Hamilton Community Benefits said it best. This is an opportunity to have a just recovery. We are seeing the effects of COVID. We're seeing the exacerbation of people that are vulnerable. And when we say vulnerable, we don't mean it as an encompassing term. We're talking about newcomers, low to moderate income folks, women, men, youth, folks with invisible and visible disabilities, seniors, students, some of which have delegated at council for the first time. So the issue of tenant vulnerability is real, is here. We see it in rental evictions. And I think as a city, we need to start collaborating with advocates like ACORN, the Hamilton Legal Clinic, and ensure that the policy decisions that we are making come from lived experience. We're hearing actual stories of people receiving N13 eviction notices. So those are the individuals that we should listen to and hear from. So we as HCCI are here to support ACORN's recommendations. When our office was open, we would provide our printer and our photocopy machines to people that needed documents. We would refer them to the legal clinic and ACORN. It's unfortunate that our office is closed right now, but again, we feel that ACORN and other housing advocates are really doing the work, are bringing this issue forward. So We support ACORN in implementing the municipal policy to restrict rental evictions, having a citywide landlord licensing program to restrict rental evictions and ensure landlords are keeping properties in good repair, expand and make permanent the tenant defense fund, and also allow for tenant education to reach tenants that are at risk of displacement. And even if they are not displaced, they need to know their rights. So we're supportive of that. And the last thing I'll say is, again, lived experience should inform policy moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, Madam Clerk, and councillors. Thank you for the opportunity to speak in support of recommendations A and B in Report 10.1 as a first step, and also to urge the city to do more. And specifically, I endorse the recommendations put forward by ACORN Hamilton on the Tenant Defense Fund and on licensing, and the Just Recovery urging that the city use all of its powers to prevent rent evictions. A written version of this presentation is on page 38 of your agenda. My main point is to underline the importance of significant eviction prevention measures. We know that eviction is a double loss. Evictions have a huge impact on the evicted tenants. They lose their home and the stability a home provides. As noted in a recent report released earlier this month by Canada Mortgage and Housing, quotes tenants speaking about their experience of eviction use language of trauma and reported anxiety, fear, feelings of loss, and depression, and other impacts. Evictions can lead to a cycle of increasing housing instability, end of quote. And of course, eviction is particularly hard on children. But the community also loses. When a unit is vacated, the landlord can and almost certainly will raise the rent. If it was a lower rent unit, we would lose another affordable unit. As I note in my written presentation, the Hamilton Census metropolitan area lost more than 10,000 affordable units in just 5 years between the 2011 and 2016 census. Those were units that rented for $750 or less a month, which is affordable on an income of $30,000. Those were all private sector units. Most of those losses were because the rents went up and moved out of that $750 bracket. In that same period, we also lost 1,700 subsidized units with rents under $750. So we lost about 40% of those lower rent units in just 5 years. And you all know, of course, that those losses are continuing. As we lose those units, pressure increases on municipal services such as shelter or healthcare, wait lists for subsidized housing grow, and pressure increases to build new affordable units. But in that 2011 to 2016 period, the city was losing those affordable units at a rate of 20 for every new unit we were able to build, 20 to 1. At that rate, of course, we'll never catch up. So eviction prevention is just as important as building new units, and it is a great deal cheaper. The measures outlined in the staff report might help some tenants defend themselves when they face eviction, and that's helpful. But as the report that I mentioned earlier, released by CMHC, noted, the nature and the scale of evictions is changing in Canada. The report says, quotes, with large corporate investment firms buying up entire buildings and sometimes whole developments and communities for redevelopment, en masse residential displacements are occurring, end of quotes. Mass evictions, of course, create significantly greater impacts. And that report added that many existing eviction prevention programs were kind of originally designed for one tenant or household being displaced at a time. Such programs may not adequately address the scale or magnitude of the evictions we're currently seeing. The expansion of the Tenants Defense Fund to cover rent evictions is welcome, but it's certainly not enough to deal with this growing large-scale problem of evictions. I suggest the committee ask staff to report back in 6 months on how the changes to the Tenant Defense Fund work out and whether the amounts provided are enough or need to be increased, and also to report back on the other measures that are mentioned in the report, updates on property standards, the ongoing licensing review, and tenant education programs. It will take concerted efforts at all levels of government to tackle the growing challenges of evictions, and particularly mass evictions. But using the city's licensing power to license and regulate landlords and creating a proactive education program could certainly help. And by proactive education, I mean reaching out to tenants in buildings whose ownership changes or whose owners submit applications for building permits for renovations. Those two steps might at least help ensure that tenants have the opportunity to exercise their right of return to their units after renovations, and exercising that right would help both the tenants who could continue their tenancy at their old rent, and it would help the community by preserving existing lower rent housing units. Thank you, and I would be happy to answer any questions you might have.